You're watching Breakthrough News.
I'm Charlotte Hohenstein, and you're watching Breakthrough News on BTR Today. On today's show, we're talking about the biggest internet security threat the world has ever seen, the Heartbleed bug. Is Heartbleed the cyber 9/11 that security analysts have been talking about for years? Here to discuss this is Alan Friedman, co-author of Cybersecurity and Cyber War, What Everyone Needs to Know, a book that came out earlier this year with Oxford University Press. And he's also the research scientist for cybersecurity policy at George Washington University. So Alan, hacking scandals are certainly not new, but Heartbleed has been described as the biggest security threat that the internet has ever seen. 500,000 websites have been affected, and essentially the bug allows hackers, as I understand it, to leach personal information, passwords, usernames, credit card info, but also these crucial security keys for the websites, which then allows them to do further damage and mimic the websites. In your opinion, is the hype real?
So this is one of the biggest debates right now, is how might someone be able to use it, and perhaps even more importantly, would we be able to tell? So as you mentioned, the Heartbleed bug allows someone to gain access to some random bits of information from a web server that uses a security piece of software called OpenSSL. It's used by about 60% of the websites online to help make sure that the information you send it, and it sends you, is encrypted, that no one in between can read it. And what it does, it allows an attacker to get what amounts to about 3 lines of text. Now, this is 3 lines of random text pulled from the memory of a web server. It's just what was ever most recently in memory. Now, that could be, and probably most often is, random information. So imagine a picture. If I pull a small sample of a picture, that's just going to be hexadecimal code. You won't be able to tell too much about it. You don't get the whole picture, you just get a snippet. But it could also be usernames, it could be passwords, and it could be the signing keys that that sets the encryption model for the entire website, allowing the attacker to essentially pretend to be this website and intercept all traffic that's coming to it. So, but to get that information, an attacker can't determine which one they want, so they just have to repeatedly query it. We found out that you can, so a company called Cloudflare did an experiment to say, hey, here's a random web server, can anyone get the keys? And it turns out that an attacker was able to get the keys quite quickly. However, using pretty basic technology, it's easy to see an attacker trying to do it. They have to query the website over and over again to get it. So what does this mean? It means that these websites are all vulnerable, but we don't know to what. Most of the major websites got their act together pretty quickly and patched the software. Patches were deployed quite quickly. And it's a question of, should all of us worry? Well, there's some basic practices we need. We need to change passwords, and large websites should get a new set of keys. They need to sort of change these keys that protect the security of the website. But I think we'll recover from this one.
So what was it then about this bug that made it such a big deal?
What made it such a big deal was the scope. It just affected every website. One of the dangers that we talk about in internet security is not just that people can act and do bad things, but that often large portions of the internet ecosystem are a monoculture or something close to it. If we find a critical...
Sorry, what does monoculture mean?
Monoculture just means we're all using the same product. So, for example, if we all use, in agriculture, where this term comes from, if we all use the same breed of corn, or an example that's going on right now, every banana in the world is a clone. They're all genetically identical. And there's now a fungus that is eating them and is slowly destroying the world's banana crop. Similarly, if we all use the same operating system, we all use the same tools, or every website uses software at some point in stack that's all common. If you find a vulnerability, then you don't just have a localized failure, you have a globalized failure. And that really highlights the fact that our risk is interdependent. You fail critically.
And that global element is actually something that I find specifically really disturbing about this bug, and I think that this bug has kind of illustrated. which is that not only are, individual users kind of at the mercy of these programmers to try and catch these loopholes, and we're just sort of vulnerable until that happens and have no idea really what's going on behind the scenes. But also in this case, the person who was responsible for this piece of code was actually a German gentleman, who presumably is sort of beyond anything that the US or the US government can do. Not that I'm saying, oh, like burn him at the stake. Like I'm not necessarily calling for punishment, but it does seem to be this strange situation where there's not really like any accountability. And I mean, he's certainly come out and said, there's no one to blame. It's a serious mistake, but a normal one, which may well be the case, for computer programmers, this kind of mistake. But then it just seems to have potentially very damaging consequences.
So you've touched on a couple of really important issues here. In the computer security world, we've talked about how do you motivate better software production, because right now anyone can write a piece of software and distribute it, and we're sort of dependent on a number of things for this software to be good. And you know what? If the stuff works, if it does stuff that I really like, am I responsible for making sure it's secure? Is it caveat emptor? Should we use a liability system where I can sue someone if it's not secure? Well, the large companies don't like that, and of course, if it's an open source software program, and a large portion of the software that we use on a daily basis, whether it's the Android operating system or the Apache web server that most websites run, or OpenSSL, which was the security feature on websites that had the Heartbleed plug, there isn't anyone that we can sue, which is of course key for a liability model. The challenge is, well, who do we hold accountable? Do we hold the websites accountable for not having better protection? Well, how do they know what to do? One of the arguments against a rigid accountability mechanism is you say, well, listen, there's risk in everything. We're worried about the pace of innovation slowing to a crawl if people are too careful. And of course, I think, like all things, we need to find a happy medium. If I have a implantable medical device, so an insulin pump or a pacemaker that's implanted, yeah, we probably want to slow down. Why should this be an internet addressable pacemaker? That seems like something that if we're going to do that, we need to set up the capacity so that, one, that code is very rigorously tested, and two, if any flaw is found, we can fix it. That's different than saying, oh, there's a game that I'm going to put on my phone, but I'm going to require that the developer buy a $20 million insurance policy. Well, that's really going to deprive us of Angry Birds, or the next Angry Birds in the future. We need to decide what's worth doing. Most of the websites that we all love today, Facebook, for example, all started out as small startups, and they all grew quickly. And if they had, at very early stages, had to go through this rigorous testing process, it probably would, and especially if there were very severe penalties for failure, it really would have slowed down innovation. From a governance perspective, we need to think of us pushing responsibility onto those that have the ability to fix themselves. So, for example, the Federal Trade Commission has said, well, listen, large companies that ignore security, standard security practices, we're going to punish you. We're going to go after companies that are careless, and that hopefully serves as a warning shot to everyone else.
So we're going to have to take a break, but right before we do, just yes or no answer. So right now, if you had to say open source code and let's say the freedom to innovate and move at this quicker pace is worth the risks that come with it, you would say yes.
In general, yes. And once we start talking about embedded devices and what's coming down in the future, as the internet stops being about the computers that we work on and starts being built into everything, then
integrated with sort of like material, physical reality.
Exactly. It's in our cars. It's in our thermostats. As it moves down that spectrum, when it gets much harder to patch, much harder to secure, then the risks go up because a mistake can be much more dangerous.
Okay. Well, we are going to take a quick break. We'll be right back in a moment after a brief excerpt from this week's episode of Serious Business featuring Mount Sharp.
You know when I tell you it's not what you hear, something strange is happening between your ears. I see in your eyes you got some weird fears, causing you to act way beneath your years. I enjoy making dumb mistakes, relative crazy sex.
We're back with our discussion on Heartbleed, the internet's biggest security threat the world has ever seen. So, Alan, you mentioned in the first segment the role of government and needing to eventually find the balance with finding some sort of liability and kind of putting the brakes on just this like total freedom to innovate with the internet. It seems though with this example of Heartbleed, first of all, it went unnoticed for 2 years, which is quite disturbing. And second of all, it just seems like this sort of loophole. I mean, how could the government possibly prevent that or find that? You know, is this kind of beyond the realm of where like the government can actually protect its civilians?
Well, you know, it's kind of interesting. Last week there was a story that asserted that the NSA knew about this for years. Now the problem was it was two sources, neither of them named, and I'm not sure which is worse, whether the NSA knew about it and was using it, or that there was this key vulnerability and the NSA didn't know about it and was just and didn't have that capacity. I don't know which one's worse. Listen, I'm far from a libertarian free market absolutist. I believe that markets can fail and there is a role for government. What I find very interesting is that this was a case where the government didn't have to play a very large role. There are private companies that have an interest in finding these vulnerabilities, either to sell to other companies, in the case of the Finnish company that discovered it, or Google, which is interested in protecting itself. There was a simultaneous discovery from what we know. And
quite bizarre, right? I mean, after 2 years of nothing.
Of course, but on the other hand,
not saying that means anything.
And indeed, this is one of the questions that's being discussed now is, one, what are the odds of simultaneous discovery, and two, how many other people knew about it. But I think the other thing that's interesting to note is, the Department of Homeland Security, which is responsible for coordinating public and private sector cybersecurity in the United States, issued a release about this several days into the crisis, well after everyone who needed to know about it probably already knew about it. Private companies were the ones that were developing the patch, that were working to deploy the patch, that were helping others learn about it, that were trying to create ways of making money to fix everyone. This isn't the best role of government, is in responding in real time to these instances. Moving forward, what we need to think about is how can government best support ad hoc dynamic responses to short-term crises, and then better understand what the incentives are to discover vulnerabilities like this in the future. You're right. Should we be worried that this bug was in there for so long? Yes. On the other hand, the fact that it's discovered means that you have a whole bunch of people that are now looking for related bugs elsewhere. Discovering vulnerabilities in software is big business.
It still seems like we're still very much entrenched in this process of patching for security. Yes. And finding these loopholes after the fact. Do you think it'll ever get to a point where we can really, in a substantial way, actually anticipate the majority of problems, or do you think that it's just impossible?
Well, there gotta remember that so there are different types of vulnerabilities. There are the flaws in a single piece of software or a single component, like Heartbleed, and then there are the flaws that are introduced because you have a modern computational system has many different layers and many different pieces that all move together, and it's almost impossible to anticipate all of the potential vulnerabilities or risks that are introduced by putting things together. The real vulnerabilities and risks are at the seams. Will software development get better? Definitely. There is something.
You're very optimistic about that.
I am. It's going to take a while. Software industry is quite new, but there are entire whole families of vulnerabilities that can be erased just by changing the language that we develop our software in. There are programming techniques that won't solve every problem, again, but that can solve whole fat classes. We're going to definitely shrink the surface. On the other hand, the more different pieces of software out there, the more millions of lines of code that we all depend on every day, means there are going to be more vulnerabilities out there. In the research community, there's a very real question about whether software gets better or worse over time. So why would it get better over time? Well, if you have all these researchers and companies looking at a piece of software, well, they'll find bugs. So over time, it will have fewer bugs. That's one approach. Another line says, well, no, listen, actually, it's going to get worse over time because the attackers are also looking for it. And if you have tens of millions of lines of code in between a user and a transaction they need to do between the operating system and the browser and the web application, then that gives you a practically infinite attack surface. This is still a very open question in the research world. So software will get better. On the other hand, attackers are also getting more clever. And of course, at the end of the day, any system is ultimately the user is the most vulnerable point. Every day, thousands and millions of very smart people, even people in the security world, click on things that they shouldn't. So my old research assistant when I was at Brookings was a student at Brown University, and he was a teaching assistant for a course on computer security. And he successfully phished a computer science professor at Brown University, who was an expert on computer security, got the professor to click on something that he shouldn't have, and could have recovered his credentials. So we are the weak link, which means any security system has to be built around this notion that a single point of failure shouldn't be enough to take down an entire organization. And the magic word around that is resiliency.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's just finish quickly on that note of the individual user. It does seem like over and over again, all you hear is, in terms of just the non-techie average Joe person with their computer, the only thing they can really do to protect themselves is change their passwords, have good passwords, and constantly upgrade their software. Is it that simple?
I think largely that's a big part of it. And you have to think about what you're at risk from. If you're worried about being part of the dragnet of people who are just trying to get 10,000 people's credit cards, all you need to do is be smarter than most other people because the attackers are just going after an average user. So all you have to do is slightly be better than that. So if you use a mail server,
bit sinister, but I guess that makes a lot of sense.
Well, there's the old joke about whether you have to outrun the bear or you just have to outrun your friend that the bear is also chasing. And sometimes there are going to be instances when the attacker wants to go after you personally. And then there really is, it's hard to be optimistic that an average non-technical user without a support staff can really defend themselves using off-the-shelf technology. There are ways, but it's much, much harder. If you're a journalist operating in politically sensitive areas, you should be talking to computer security experts. On the other hand, if you're just someone who uses credit cards, listen, you're not at risk in the United States for anyone misusing your credit cards. If someone empties your bank account tomorrow morning, you're not liable. You just go in and you say, I didn't make that transaction. They're legally required. We are very well protected in this country with the American legal system. So you have to worry about someone misusing your account, and you have to worry about someone in your personal life maybe trying to do something a little more sinister against you. And there are a number of protections against that. If your email service uses two-factor authentication like Gmail does, today's the day to set it up. If you haven't set it up, Today's the day to do it. If your email password has ever been used anywhere else, you have to change it. The most important thing, one piece of advice, is make sure your password for your personal email that you use to coordinate all your social networks and all your banks, your personal email password has to be different from every other password you use. That way, if any of those other websites are compromised, no one can use that to then attack everything else in your personal identity.
That's very helpful and also quite reassuring. And on that note, I think we will draw the conversation to a close. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. I'm Charlotte Hohenstein, and this is Breakthrough News, an independent news show for the free thinking web. We bring you a range of voices on the issues that today's generation is thinking about. Be sure to check out breakthroughradio.com through the weekend for our continued Identity Week coverage as we explore how comic books and superhero movies are leading the fight for equal gender representation in media. That's it for what's breaking through the news today. Tell us what's breaking through your world on Twitter @Breakthrough News. I'm Charlotte Hohenstein, and thank you for joining us. Thank you, Alan, as well, for joining us. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Bye.